Liza, we're embarking this year on going deeper into studio thinking and developing our understanding around studio habits of mind. I was wondering, though, what you were hoping to discover through your research.
Through the studio thinking
Yeah,
research.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, we had just come off. So Ellen Winter is one of the co-authors that
Yeah.
I have worked with a good deal, and Ellen and I had just come off a study that we did when I was a doctoral student at Harvard, and there were many, many claims at that time in the United States that arts made you smarter in other subjects, and we thought, well, maybe, but we hadn't seen the literature that was compelling.
Yep.
And so we decided to do a very hairy statistical procedure called a meta-analysis and see if we could actually find out if the science backed up the claims.
Yep.
And so we ended up actually doing 10 meta-analyses. We did what's called an exhaustive search, and it was, because you're supposed to find all the studies that have ever been done, whether they were published or unpublished. Anyway, it's a big deal to find. The search took almost 2 years. We went back to 1950. So we're looking at all the studies from 1950 to 1995 that assessed some aspect of arts and some aspects of cognitive achievement. And so we did 10 analyses, and what we found was that the claims far exceeded the evidence. There were, of the 10 meta-analyses we did, 3 of them had positive and consequential results. 2 of those were music relating to spatial outcomes.
Yep.
And the other one was drama relating to verbal outcomes. But general arts making you smarter on general standardized tests or achievement of various kinds, it just, math, music didn't make you smarter in math, maybe, almost. Maybe there should have been more studies. Dance didn't make you smarter in spatial. It was just, the research just wasn't there to make the claims. And so we published that research and got a lot of hate mail.
Yeah, I can imagine.
People did not like the fact that the emperor wasn't wearing any clothes. And so, but as a result of that study, we were never hostile to the arts, although some people seem to think that we were. And we thought, well, why are people making these kinds of arguments? Why are they saying that you should have arts in your schools because it makes you smarter in math? Why is this being done? And we thought it may be because people don't have a language to talk about what the arts actually do and what they do that is really valuable and is significant to the arts as arts, not as a proxy to learning in something else. So that's why we undertook the studio thinking research. And we were hoping to find what was taught in rigorous visual arts classes. We used visual art because we were funded by the Getty.
Yep.
So it was a visual funder. So that's why we focused on the visual arts. And we went to 2 different rigorous visual arts focused high schools, or they were arts focused high schools. One was public in Boston and the other was private out in Natick. And we videotaped classes for once a month, and the classes were 3 hours of 5 different teachers. And then we argued and analyzed. We looked and tried to see what were these teachers teaching. And we would take clips where we thought we knew, we had an opinion about what they were doing, and we'd show it to them. We'd take it back and show it to them and say, what are you teaching here and why are you doing it like that? So that if we were trying to refute our assumptions. And after doing that we had about 105 hours of video that we analyzed. And then we analyzed it for about 2 full years. And through all of the arguing and member checks and catalog, chunking things together and going through every single, we transcribed all the classes and category, had multiple coders looking at the stuff. We thought that we were finally coming up with what it was that the art teachers were intending to teach. And we had a lot of evidence from the video clips and from the transcripts. So I think we found what we were hoping to find, which is a language that would be a good enough proxy for the kind of mind that the teachers were trying to develop.
Do you feel, Lois, that like some of that was like, I guess, a hidden curriculum or a unknown curriculum?
Well, I don't know. It always reminds me of people looking at modern art and saying, I could do that. My 4-year-old could do that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's something about the 8 studio habits that we eventually landed on and named and framed that just seems so obvious now. Like, of course, that's what you're teaching. Of course, you're teaching observe. Of course, you're teaching to engage and persist. But it wasn't obvious before we named them. And then when we did name them, having had this experience before with the previous research project I'd been on where everybody hated our outcomes, I was thinking, well, I wonder how people are going to feel about this. I wonder if they're just going to go, oh, God, that's not what teaching art is.
Yeah.
But in fact, people seem to really recognize themselves in it. It's like, yes, that is what I'm teaching.
Yeah.
And they embraced it. They really said, wow, this is great. We can really use this. And then they used it. So it was pretty great.
What surprised you the most about the research, Lois?
I wasn't really surprised by any of the 8 studio habits. They seemed, once we nailed them to the floor, they seemed right.
Yeah.
And it was a bit frustrating that we couldn't get them down to fewer, cognitive scientists say that the human brain can accept 5 plus or minus 2 bits of information. So we really wanted to have 7, but in fact we had 11, and we combined so that it would be 8. And it's been really interesting to me to see that people genuinely thought this was helpful and I'm still surprised that people are still buying the book and still, I see it all over the place. It's surprising. It's gratifying, but it's really wonderful and kind of shocking when you stumble on something that really needs to be done and you do it well enough. I've seen this over and over, that the studio habits end up being kind of a Rosetta Stone.
Yeah.
They allow people to translate across different contexts, and that's very exciting.
Is there a particular way, I guess, that you see teachers now using this research? Do you have a preference or a vision for it, or what are your thoughts?
It's been a really nice cycle between, we went to teachers who were experts and we did research with them, and then we created this theoretical framework, and then we gave the framework back to them, and then they used it, and then they gave us back lots of information. Yeah. So and then we synthesize it, get new ideas, and it's this nice back and forth, because I think practice, the wisdom of practice, is not often validated to the extent that it needs to be. People really need to realize that people who are in the classrooms with the kids, having these experiences, thousands of experiences a day, really do understand things. And that it's been wonderful to see the ways that people have learned them. So there tends to be sort of there's a learning curve on this. And the learning curve tends to go, you give somebody the framework. And of course, the framework has 2 parts. It's not just the studio habits of mind. It's also the studio structure.
Yep.
So we can talk about those later. But you give somebody the habits of mind, let's see, and they say, oh, those seem right. There's very little resistance. There's mostly a sense of, oh yeah, this is exciting. This is going to be useful to me. And then they go off, and no matter what you ask them to do, they apply it to their own practice. So they look at what they're doing, and they don't look at their kids so much. They look at their curriculum, or they look at the assignments that they make, or the projects that they do. And they say, oh, I think this one's about observe, or I think this one's about, observe and envision, or this one's about develop, craft, and express, and then how they tug at each other, those two habits, tug back and forth. Since develop craft is the language that we use to speak artistically in visual art, and expresses the meaning that we're trying to give. It's like, if you've got some meaning that you're trying to say, then you use your craft as tool, as language, and then you don't use it sufficiently, so you learn more craft, and then maybe you can say it better, and then as you say it better, you think, but maybe that isn't exactly what I really wanted to express. So then I'm going to use anyway. And so there's this wonderful generative tension that happens between them. But people don't figure that out right away. Usually what they figure out is they take some hunk of something and they name stuff. That's observe. That's understand art world. That's develop craft. This is that. This is that. This is that. And after they get comfortable, and sometimes they do that in their own artistic practice, sometimes they do it just in their teaching practice. But after they start to do that, then they start to bring it into looking at their kids' work. So the first thing they do is they name it in their own practice. Then they tend to plan using the habits, so that they're designing curriculum or assignments or something using the habits of mind. Then they often start talking with the kids about them. They'll introduce them to the kids and give it to the students as language, so that the students can talk then about observing or envisioning or stretching, exploring, engaging, and persisting. And then at that point, we've seen people start to play around with them in assessment. Once it's in the kids' mind that these are categories, then the students and the teachers can start to reflect with them, whether that's in a critique session or in written reflections, or in the teachers having a desk critique with a student during students at work, going around to each student and talking to them. And they'll say, it looks to me like that you have a vision of what this waterfall looks like, the colors in the waterfall. But so how are you envisioning that? And did you see something like that once? Or are you observing? And so then they start to sort of bring it into the conversation. Finally, it's the last step seems to be assessment. And that would be assessment of student work. But it's really of student working, because the work itself reveals some things, but it's really the process. So formative assessment is how people really begin to use these in sort of looking at what habits of mind students are developing. First, what they're using, and then eventually what they're developing. Where are they being challenged to use studio habits with more sophistication? Because each one of the studio habits is kind of an empty bin, and you want to start throwing different ideas that belong in that bin in there. For each student, you want to make their own bin full of these things, and then you want them to organize this stuff within express, or within engage and persist, or reflect, so that you want them to have a denser and denser network within each category. So we see a lot of times the teachers making the learning visible. They will often put a studio habits wheel up on the wall, and sometimes the constructivist teachers would notice when a student was doing something and ask the students to write it down and go put it on a post-it and stick it on the observe part. Or and then the kids start doing it on their own. And
Yeah.
um,
It's
so
almost part of it's just like you're saying is just drawing a greater attention to some of the things that are already being done by students, and then sort of trying to push and encourage them, to become more sophisticated, or to see situations in which, observe might be able to advance their ability to express something because they're seeing a greater level of detail, or, they're able to capture a greater sense of what it is.
artists and art that people who are really teaching art, they don't think in the studio habits categories
Yeah.
because they think but they manifest them.
Yeah.
And so what they can do is if they when they see the studio habits, they recognize. One of my colleagues, Steve Locke, is a wonderful painter, and now of course he's doing lots of other stuff too, sculpture and neon and just all sorts of stuff. But when we first met, which was around the time Studio Thinking was published, he didn't see any relationship between his teaching and his art practice. He thought,
Yes.
I've got my art practice over here and I've got my teaching over here, and that's, they're different. And then when he saw the studio habits, he saw that they were the interface between his art practice and his teaching. And he realized that he was doing the same things in his practice that he was trying to teach his students. And then he could start to name them. And I think that's taking somebody who's at this gaseous level where, it's like sophisticated understanding of art and artistry and being an artist and other people's art is so extreme that he didn't see the connection to the simpler stuff that he was doing in his teaching of students.
I mean, it's not uncommon for artists to struggle to talk about their practice, and that might be because coming back to what we were saying before, that common language or a common way of unpacking and understanding it. So it sounds like what I'm hearing there, that he, once that there was that common language, he could make not necessarily a bridge. More broadly, but just within his own practice to, the students to be able to recognize, when he was envisaging something, or when he was, engaging and persisting and, problem solving.
Well, I think the thing is that, for an artist, their practice is so dense and sophisticated and, in those things. And what they're teaching to their students is sort of what Dave Perkins would call the junior version. It's sort of, he wrote a book called Making Learning Whole, and he talked about there's the game of baseball, but the kids in his neighborhood always had sandlot baseball. They had these pickup baseball games, and there might be one base, and there might be 3 kids. And so they're doing the essence of the game, but it's the junior version of the game. So they're playing the real game, but the real game gets simplified down to something that a kid can do.
Yeah.
And then you look at the major leagues, and that's the full-blown, expertise. But there is a relationship between the expertise. There needs to be a relationship between the expertise of the experts and what's taught to the beginners, because otherwise there's no trail of breadcrumbs that leads from one place to the other. Very few of the students that most people teach will become artists.
Yeah.
But what I want in any subject is for them to develop the mind of a disciplinarian.
Yes.
So in mathematics, I want them to develop a mathematical mind. In history, I want them to develop a historical mind. And in art, I want them to develop an artist's mind.
Yep.
And I think when people leave school, what we want them to have is a set of lenses that they can take out. It's like, oh, what if I put on my art lenses now and I can look at this thing that's going on, phenomena, or this object or whatever, with them. But maybe I want to look at it mathematically or scientifically. But what we're trying to do is develop a set of lenses so that we can think in different ways.
With the studio habits of mind, what are the fundamental or underlying parts? How do you see each one of those breaking apart?
Well, first of all, each one of them is a disposition.
Yep.
So, and again, this is another David Perkins idea. And it started in the thinking skills curriculum, thinking about how to teach thinking. And the idea was, I mean, people were always thinking about thinking skills. And then they would find that they would teach thinking skills really well, and people would really know how, they would really have the skills, but their thinking didn't improve when they were given new problems. And that's the definition of understanding that we use at Project Zero. It's the capacity to use what you know flexibly in novel circumstances.
Yeah.
So, they were having this, they would have great thinking skills. They would be able to estimate, and they would be able to predict, and they would be able to compare and contrast, and they would, be able to do all of these things, but they wouldn't be better thinkers. So they started looking then at what's missing. They've got these great skills. What don't they have? And they realized they didn't have a couple of attitudes that they needed. And those are the other corners of a disposition. So the first corner of the disposition is skill. You do need skill. The second corner is, I don't know that if anything's fundamental, it would probably be inclination, which is So inclination, that's like motivation or drive or need or passion or the wanting to use these skills.
Yeah, okay.
They're for something, and I want to use them for that. So let's say I have reading skills, but I'm not inclined to pick up a book or read or whatever. So it's like, who cares? We've just wasted my time teaching me all these skills, but I don't know what they're for, so I don't want to use them. And then the third corner of the dispositions triangle is alertness. And alertness is sort of the when and where do you use this stuff? So here comes life streaming by us, and we say, oh, I just noticed an opportunity. Somebody just said something about something that I don't understand. I don't know who that is or what that thing is, but I have the skills of reading. So, and I can search on the web.
Yep.
So those skills I have. So I'm going to use those skills. I'm inclined to use those skills to figure out this thing that I'm curious about. So what ends up is that the disposition has skill, inclination, and alertness. And those things sort of pull at each other and punch at each other, and it makes this nice triadic sort of engine. And each of the studio habits is, in fact, a disposition. So a lot of times people will think about develop craft, and they'll think, well, that's a skill. That's where you're developing skill. But you're also developing skill when there's skills in engaging and persisting.
Yeah.
There's skills in searching and exploring. There's skills in understanding the art world.
Yeah.
So there's skills in all of them. And then you go back to develop craft and say, okay, if you say that's a skill, then you're saying you don't need the inclination to use your skill? Of course you do. I mean, it's like if you're looking at this sculpture you've made and the corners don't quite fit together right, but they need to, that for you're not trying to, the thing you're trying to express requires a neat corner, and you're not willing to go back in and be inclined to use your craft to create that neat corner.
Yeah.
It's like, who cares that you can make a neat corner? You haven't done it.
Yeah.
And of course, the artwork is an opportunity for you to see that here's a time I could use that skill that I know about how to make a neat corner. So you need to be alert to the opportunities in your working process. It's like, no, I'm not trying to say something about casualness. I'm trying to say something that's more formal and more precise and more about accuracy. So each one of these things has skill, inclination, and alertness. And in the new book, the elementary book, skill is, can I do it? Inclination is, will I do it? And alertness is, when and where might I do it?
Yeah.
When and where. So that's the basics that underlies everything.
Yeah.
there's a couple other things that underlie everything. One is that artistry, making is at the center of artistry. So while we're talking about understand art worlds, that, you know, you could think, oh, that's about art history. And it is, except that this is a studio thinking. And art history is actually an academic subject.
Yep.
Artists, though, use the objects that other people have made and that are being made now and have been made throughout time in a slightly different way than art historians do. They approach them differently. The research that artists do to see what their ideas are in conversation with. You know, it's what's the discourse community around this work that I'm starting to make. That's what artists are doing with Understand Art World. So it's a different intention. You know, they're not trying to to nail down the iconography and look at the historical precedents and look at all that. They're just trying to get in and start having the conversation with people whom their work is also in contact with, whether it's, you know, a 10th century Chinese poet or, you know, somebody who's living next door or working next to you in your studio.
Yep.
So making has to be at the center, and this is an idea from Arts Propel, which was done at Project Zero in 1989 to the mid-90s. And in that project, they said, you know, making needs to stay at the center. And then perception, as you make, you perceive differently. And so those two things are affecting each other. I make and I perceive, and I make and I perceive. And then reflection is the third corner of that particular triangle. So I make and I perceive things differently, and then I reflect on those things I see differently, and then my reflection changes my making, and then my making changes my reflection, and and everything's going around and around. Yeah. So that's also a sort of a foundational idea of the studio thinking framework. Originally, when we were working on it, we were thinking that we might find some things that they were teaching that were about making, some that were about perception, and some that were about reflection. But we found that those things happen in all of the habits. I mean, that there's making and reflection and perception that's involved in all of it. So it didn't make sense to categorize the habits that way.
Lois, can you tell us a little bit more about the studio structure and for learning and the approach in which the studio habits of mind, I guess, needs to sit?
Yeah, so the studio structures are really about, I always say they're how art teachers organize time, space, and interactions in art classrooms. Okay. And so we originally had 3, and that was a big surprise to me, actually, in the work, that as we looked at all these disparate practices of art teachers, that we could describe everything that was going on using just 3 structures. We could, you know, there's this demo lecture, and you could call it a demo lecture interactive when it turns into a discussion, but it's, you know, it's short, it's showing, it's giving information that they need to use right away. Yep. And you don't want it to be long, because you want to reserve most of the time for students at work. So, you know, you've got a class period, you're going to have some demo lecture, but you don't want it to get in the way and take away all the working time. Yep. So you have to, you know, finesse that. Then the students at work, I mean, everybody has students making in their studio classes. And so the students are making, the teacher's floating around and talking to them. So it's an individualized curriculum. Whether you're doing an entirely choice-based curriculum, or whether you're doing a project-based curriculum, or even a production-based curriculum, everybody still has the students at work time, and everybody's going around and talking to each. So that was really surprising. And then there was critique. And there are so many varieties of critique, because critique can look like the art school drop kick, what do they call it? My students call them pit critiques. You know, it's sort of like where teachers say to students in the critique, the only solution for that painting is gesso. and other horrible things.
Ouch. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what art students think of critique as. But critique is also, I mean, basically it's talking about art. It's talking about the art you made.
Yeah.
And we talk about in-process critiques and final critiques and reviews, and we talk about one-on-one critiques, and you can have nonverbal critiques, or you can have like envelope critiques where you have put an envelope by everybody's artwork and you just walk around and put a little note in for each person, or
I like
post-it
that.
notes.
Yeah.
So, various ways. And kids love that because they come back to their artwork after having looked at everybody else's, and they've got all these little valentines, telling them about things that they noticed in their art. So yes, there are many, many ways to critique. Yes, there are many, many ways to do a students at work and demo lecture. But those three things are pretty much moving within the art classroom. And sometimes people will start with a demo lecture, go to students at work, and end with a critique. And that's sort of a typical, or they might start with a demo lecture, have the students at work, and then end with a demo lecture. Sort of an ABA kind of form. But a lot of times we saw, especially with younger students or students who are less skilled, that there would be a more punctuated form. So we'd start maybe with a critique from last class. That would be just 5 minutes. And then we would do a little tiny demo lecture. And then there'd be a short students at work period. And then we'd talk about what we did. And then another demo lecture and another little students at work. And so and then when I started looking at dance classes, I realized that the structure of a dance class is mostly, there's sort of a 15-second or 20, maybe 30-second demo lecture, 2 minutes of students at work, and then a 10-second critique. And then it just goes. So it's just a shorter cycle.
Yeah.
And in musical conducting, in like a band or an orchestra and an ensemble practice, that the students at work is happening simultaneously with the demo lecture, because the conductor is up there demo lecturing the whole time. That's what the conductor's doing, and then the students are making the work. So it's really interesting to see how it changes across the art forms. But so 3 structures, and they seem to work for just broadly for everything. The only thing you need to include is the interactive part of demo lecture if you want to get to, because discussion is a big part of a lot of non-art classes. And so that's the thing there's less of that in an art class. Most of the discussion comes in critique, but there's still discussion. And then after we, the book had been out for 6 years and we were working on the 2nd edition, we realized that exhibition was another studio structure. It seems to be at a different grain size than, I think it's more like exhibition is sometimes a unit of instruction. And within exhibition, you've got demo lectures, students at work, and but when you move exhibition from something the teacher does to make the halls pretty to something that the students do to make their work public and have a public conversation about it with a broader audience, that's when you start to see it as a learning structure. And I think it's a very exciting learning structure, and one that's really important, because until you take the art out from under your bed and put it on the wall where somebody's going to see it, it's not art.
I think it brings in a whole other aspect of the art world, which is curation, and how does an exhibition tell a story versus a single artwork? And I think that's one that I've definitely appreciated, working with students on, is getting them to understand that cohesive narrative. Of that, they're not just separate images, that together they tell a fuller story.
Well, and then when you start looking at artists like Fred Wilson going in and taking museums' collections and curating an exhibition that puts one object next to another in a
Yeah.
way that makes you perceive colonialism
Yeah.
or the oppression of slavery, and you see, you know, a beautiful painting of a plantation, and then you see, um, you know, something that is something of a slave quarter or something that makes you know about slavery, then you begin to see everything very, very differently. So it's a very powerful tool for teaching and learning. And I think when we give it to kids, we give them a lot of power. So I think there's just all sorts of exciting things that can go on when kids begin to see exhibition as not just something that, you know, those kings and queens in the museum do, but
Yeah.
something that people do and that
Yeah.
you can. So it gives them a lot more creative fodder, and it
Yep.
also gives them a lot more ownership of the art world.
So many insights. Thanks so much, Lois. Just wondering, so we're going to be looking at the studio habits of mind over the rest of the year. What advice would you give us as we embark on that journey?
Well, I think one of the things you want to do is um, get a more and more sophisticated understanding of what belongs in each bin.
Yep.
And so, you know, there are really 11 bins because Develop Craft has got studio practice as well as technique. So if you start, and then Understand Art World has got domain, the stuff, and communities. So that's where collaboration and all of
Yeah.
that, you know, teamwork and critical friends and all of the different ways that artists work together. And then there's Reflect, which has question and explain and evaluate. And evaluate is so important because kids have to evaluate, is their work done? They have to evaluate what makes it done, how good is it, who says it's good. It gets into aesthetics and to style and to, you know, value judgments and to assumptions and intentions. And it also gets into the fact that the art world, that judgments are not immutable. So you can look at things like, you know, the fountain, the urinal that Duchamp submitted, and it was rejected from the open art show. You know, everything was accepted except they wouldn't show his urinal, um, and it's like, so it was rejected. It was bad art, but now it's an icon of ready-made art in every art book. So judgments can change over time, and that gets you to think about audience and who is this work for, and, you know, maybe it's not for the people who don't like it. Maybe it's not expressing, maybe it's not using the language of craft well enough to express what you're trying to say. So there's just all of this subtlety and complexity. Anyway, so those 3 habits have 2 parts. And then, of course, there's stretch and explore. And then there's engage and persist. A lot of times people just think of engage and persist, and they sort of miss the engage part. They just see the persist part. And it's like, there are skills of persistence and inclinations to persist and alertness to when to persist. But there's also all those 3 things about engage. And it's engagement that is the motor. That's the fuel for what makes you persist.
I
If you
think
just try to persist because you're a good kid and you were assigned this project, it's like a battery. It'll run out. You know, you've got to have the engagement in order to do all the grueling work that you have to do to bring something to completion. And so if you have a diverse group of people who are running their art classes differently, each one of them is going to be throwing different things into the bins. And then when you take them all out and spread them out and look at them and start to organize them, which ones go together, which one, and what's the name of this little cluster here and then what's the name of this cluster, and what's the relationship between this cluster and that cluster, and so that you end up getting a much more sophisticated understanding of each category. And that will give you ideas about what you can do with them beyond just naming that's observe, that's engage, list. You know, that's not that interesting. It gets old pretty quick. But then, of course, you know, it's also fun, I think, to take an exchange. Like if they could get somebody to videotape them in a as they, so you videotape a conversation with a kid and then take it apart. And it's like, which habits were going on there? Did you do
Yeah.
this? And what was the pathway in that conversation? We started with observe, but then we went immediately to develop craft. But then I made that reference to understand art worlds because I was talking about Klimt.
Yeah.
And, we went down to express, and and we were reflecting the whole time. So, it's just, I think it's interesting to start to look at some of I call them generative tensions. And I think that's a really good way to think of them, because it's all about the connections and the associations that you make among them and between them and across them. That's where it gets exciting. That's where it's art. That's where it stops being a categorizing of things and starts to be a real artistic process.
All right. So Lois, we've got Studio Thinking. It's been released for a while. Studio Thinking in elementary schools, is that's still yet to hit the stands?
Yes, it's due out in late August or early September, so it should be available pretty soon. And there's a lot of how teachers have used the habits in different ways. So there's portraits of teachers. There's a big chapter on assessment where we come down very hard on formative assessment instead of summative assessment. And we talk about looking for three kinds of students. You can look for students who are disengaged. Students are engaged extrinsically. They're doing it for the grade or to be a good kid or because that's what you do in school. And then students who are intrinsically engaged. And then once you have those, you can do a studio habit profile with a kid. So there's no sense doing a studio habit profile with a disengaged kid. With a disengaged kid, you just gotta engage them. You gotta help them find the thing that brings them into this conversation. With extrinsically engaged kids, it's very useful to do a studio habits profile because you'll find strengths and weaknesses. And that's all explained in the book. And then once you find the strengths and weaknesses, you can decide to have a focus habit for the next bit of instructional time. So it's like, and you can pick either a strength, a habit that's a strength for the kid, or a habit that's a weakness. And then, you can build up a weakness, and you could have them help you decide what would the focus habit be. And then you could do, once you get a focus habit, you can think about the focus habit in terms of the skill, the inclination, and the alertness, and find out where's the issue with this? Where can this habit grow? Where could it be stronger? Yep. Is it in inclination? Is it in alertness? Or is it in skill? So I think that's a really fascinating chapter. There's a poem, an anonymous children's poem, that goes, "A centipede was happy quite, until a frog in fun said, 'Pray, which leg comes after which?' This raised her mind to such a pitch, she lay distracted in a ditch, considering how to run." And I think this over-architecturizing of your curriculum, it's like, I can geek out on 8 studio habits or maybe 11, and then 3 dispositions for each. So that's 33, and start to play around with the relations between them and among them and all of that. But I think if you keep it playful, and it's like, you're not trying to learn it all. You're playing with this stuff. And as you do, you get more and more comfortable and you can run again. You are doing this stuff, but sometimes you're not going over there enough, or you're not going over here enough.
Yeah.
Or, you're just sticking in this one corner too much. And the studio habits can help you to sort that out. But they're not going to help you do anything if you just lie on your back and wave your legs and just going, "Oh, well, I'm doing it right now."
Brilliant. Lois, thank you so much. Appreciate your time today, particularly at the end of a term. And you're heading into summer, we're heading into winter. So we hope that you get a bit of a break
Right.
in all of that. But thank you for joining us and sharing with us today your insights into your research. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I was happy to do so, and I hope you'll all look at the new book, because I think it's got some really interesting examples, and not just for elementary and middle school teachers. I
Yeah.
mean, that assessment chapter is something that might be more applicable to high school. If you've got 500 to 700 kids, it's going to be harder to do any very serious assessment. But if you've got 50 to 180, the way high school teachers do, you could really do some pretty serious assessment.